The stars had never seemed so close, yet so threatening. Commander Ginho stood in the observation deck of the newly built orbital station, watching the alien vessels approach Earth. 3 massive ships, each one larger than anything humanity had ever constructed, moved through space with an elegance that made Earth's clunky spacecraft look like children's toys. This was it. First contact. The moment humanity had dreamed about for centuries. Ginho adjusted his uniform and checked his reflection in the polished steel wall. He was a military man, trained for combat, not diplomacy. But Earth's governments had chosen him for a reason. He was calm under pressure, spoke multiple languages, and most importantly, he understood that sometimes the best weapon was a steady hand and a clear mind. Behind him, Captain Murray was setting up recording equipment. Every second of this meeting would be documented, analyzed, remembered for all of human history. The alien ambassador arrived with little ceremony. The airlock hissed open, and a being unlike anything Ginho had ever imagined stepped through. Ambassador Theron of the Velthic Combine stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. 4 arms moved with precise, calculated gestures, and large black eyes surveyed the human delegation with what Ginho could only describe as boredom. Behind Theron came a dozen guards. Armed with weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, Ginho stepped forward and bowed slightly, a gesture of respect practiced 1,000 times. He spoke in carefully prepared words, welcoming the Velthic to Earth and expressing humanity's desire for peaceful relations and mutual cooperation. Theron listened without moving, those black eyes never blinking. When Ginho finished, the alien ambassador made a gesture with 2 of its arms that the translation device rendered as dismissive amusement. Theron began to speak, and the translator converted the sounds into flat, emotionless sentences. The Galactic Assembly, Theron explained, was a union of 847 civilized species. They had discovered Earth and deemed humanity suitable for integration into the Assembly. This was not a negotiation or a request. It was simply the way things were done. New species did not have rights. They had responsibilities. The terms were delivered with the same casual tone one might use to order lunch. Humanity would submit to Assembly authority immediately. Earth would provide 60% of its resources as integration fees, to be collected over the next 10 standard cycles. Additionally, 100 million humans would be conscripted for labor across Assembly worlds, working in mines, factories, in service industries to help support the greater galactic civilization. Ginho felt his blood run cold, but his face remained calm. Beside him, Captain Murray's hand tightened on her tablet, but she too showed no outward reaction. The other human delegates, scientists and politicians selected for their brilliance and composure, stood in shocked silence. This was not first contact. This was subjugation. Ginho took a breath and responded with careful politeness. He thanked Ambassador Theron for the explanation, but explained that humanity could not accept those terms. Instead, he proposed an alternative arrangement. Earth would happily join the Galactic Assembly as an equal partner. Sharing resources and knowledge through fair trade agreements, humanity would contribute to galactic civilization, but would maintain its sovereignty and freedom. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Theron's forearms went rigid, and for the first time, those black eyes focused sharply on Ginho. The alien ambassador made a sound that the translator struggled to interpret, settling on something between laughter and disgust. Theron explained, in tones that made it clear the ambassador was speaking to a particularly stupid child, that newly discovered species did not negotiate, they complied. This was the law of the Assembly, unchanged for 12,000 years. Ginho met those alien eyes without flinching. He explained that humanity had its own laws, its own history, and its own dignity. They would not become slaves, no matter how the Assembly chose to phrase it. If the Assembly wanted partnership, humanity would gladly work together. But submission was not an option. Theron's response was immediate and cold. By refusing the terms of integration, humanity had violated Assembly law. By claiming rights they had not been granted, Earth had committed an act of defiance against galactic order. Ambassador Theron, speaking with the full authority of the Galactic Assembly Council, declared humanity in violation of interstellar treaty. A punitive fleet would be dispatched to bring Earth into compliance. The humans had one standard cycle to reconsider their foolish decision. The alien delegation left without another word, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent station. As the airlock sealed behind them, Captain Murray stopped the recording and looked at Ginho with wide eyes. One of the politicians, a woman who had spent 30 years in international negotiations, sat down heavily in a chair and put her head in her hands. They all understood what had just happened. Humanity's first contact with alien life had just turned into a declaration of war. Ginho immediately contacted Earth Command. Within hours, emergency meetings were convened in every major capital. The United Earth government, formed just 5 years earlier to speak with one voice to the stars, now faced its first real test. The recordings of the meeting were broadcast worldwide. People watched in horror and anger as the alien ambassador casually demanded the enslavement of humanity. The debates were fierce but brief. Some argued for acceptance of the terms, claiming that resistance against a civilization of 847 species was suicide. Others demanded immediate preparation for war, unwilling to bow to threats regardless of the cost. In the end, the decision was unanimous, if only because any other choice was unthinkable. Humanity would not surrender. They would not become slaves. If the Galactic Assembly wanted Earth, they would have to take it by force. 3 weeks later, the Velthic fleet arrived. 300 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. They moved in perfect formation, a display of overwhelming power meant to terrify any primitive species into immediate compliance. Fleet Commander Vorath, leader of the punitive force, had done this 14 times before. It always ended the same way. The primitives saw the fleet, realized resistance was hopeless, and begged for mercy. But as Vorath's sensors scanned the inner solar system, something unusual appeared on the displays. The human vessels, crude things powered by fusion reactors and primitive drives, were not running. They were not broadcasting surrender. Instead, they were moving into defensive positions around their homeworld. More concerning, the humans had somehow fortified their fourth planet, a dusty red world they called Mars. With weapons, platforms, and defensive structures, Vorath felt something he had not experienced in many years. Not fear exactly. The Velthic did not feel fear the way humans did, but uncertainty crept into his thoughts. These primitives were supposed to understand their place in the galactic order. Instead, they were preparing to fight. Vorath gave the order to proceed. A quick demonstration of superior firepower at the Mars colony would surely bring the humans to their senses. He dispatched 2,000 soldiers to secure the facility and remind humanity. What happened to species who forgot their place on Mars? Sergeant Dayun received the warning just minutes before the Velthic landing craft began their descent. He had 50 Marines under his command, a skeleton crew left to oversee the mining operations. Against 2,000 enemy soldiers with superior technology, they had no chance of victory. Dayan gathered his people in the central command center and gave them a choice. They could surrender and hope for mercy, or they could fight and make the aliens pay for every inch of Martian soil. Not a single Marine chose surrender. Dayan smiled grimly and began issuing orders. They had mining equipment, explosives, and a detailed knowledge of every tunnel and chamber in the facility. If these aliens wanted Mars, humanity would teach them the first lesson in a curriculum of violence that had been perfected over 10,000 years of human warfare. The Velthic were about to discover what happened when you attacked a species that had turned war into an art form. The Velthic soldiers had never encountered resistance like this before. They landed on Mars expecting a simple occupation, perhaps a few scattered defensive positions that would crumble under their superior firepower. Instead, they walked into a nightmare designed by Sergeant Dayun and his 50 Marines. The mining colony had been transformed into a death trap. Every corridor and chamber turned into a killing ground. The Velthic advanced in standard formation, their energy shields flickering as they moved through the main entrance. The humans let them come, watching from hidden positions as 2,000 alien soldiers poured into the facility. Then Dayon gave the signal, and the Mars colony became hell. Explosives rigged throughout the support structures brought down entire sections of ceiling, crushing dozens of Velthic soldiers under tons of rock and metal. The mining lasers, meant for cutting through stone, carved through alien armor with horrifying efficiency. But what truly shocked the Velthic was the ferocity of the human defenders. The Marines did not fall back when outnumbered. They did not surrender when surrounded. Instead, they fought with a savagery that the Velthic, evolved on a peaceful world and conditioned by millennia of civilized warfare, could not comprehend. When ammunition ran out, the humans used mining tools as weapons. When those broke, they used their bare hands. Dayon himself killed 17 Velthic soldiers before he fell. His last act was to detonate the main reactor, taking another 100 enemies with him in a blast that could be seen from orbit. When the surviving Velthic finally retreated to their landing craft, they left behind 1,400 of their comrades. The Mars facility was destroyed, and every human defender was dead, but the Velthic had learned a terrifying truth. These humans did not fear death. They embraced it if it meant taking enemies with them. Fleet Commander Vorath watched the reports with growing disbelief. 50 primitives had killed 1,400 of his soldiers. The survivors were traumatized, speaking in horrified tones about humans who kept fighting even when mortally wounded, who smiled as they died if they could take one more enemy down. This was not normal behavior. This was insanity. On Earth, news of the Mars massacre spread quickly. The colonies and stations throughout the solar system mourned their dead heroes. But beneath the grief was something harder, something cold and sharp. The Velthic had come to Earth offering slavery or death. Sergeant Dayon and his Marines had shown them what humanity's answer would be. Now it was time for the entire species to deliver that message with clarity. Admiral Borum stood in Earth's command center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the positions of every human and alien vessel in the solar system. She was 70 years old, a veteran of the resource wars that had nearly torn Earth apart 3 decades earlier. She had hoped humanity's first meeting with aliens would be peaceful. That hope was dead now, buried on Mars along with 50 of her people. Borum activated Protocol Defiance, a military plan developed over years of careful study and preparation. Humanity had always known that first contact might not be friendly. Every disaster scenario had been considered, every possible enemy analyzed. The protocols drawn up by Earth's military theorists assumed that any hostile alien species would have better technology. So the plans focused on what humanity did better than anyone else in their own history: adapt, improvise, and fight with absolute commitment. Dr. Hyunwoo received the captured Velthic soldiers in his laboratory with scientific curiosity and growing understanding. The xenobiologist had spent years wondering what alien life might look like, how their bodies and minds might differ from humans. Now he had subjects to study, and what he discovered was both fascinating and tactically valuable. The Velthic brain chemistry was radically different from human neurochemistry. They had evolved on a world with abundant resources and few predators, developing intelligence for cooperation rather than competition. Most significantly, the Velthic were biologically programmed to avoid risk. Their neural pathways released powerful negative chemicals in response to dangerous situations, making them naturally cautious and conservative in their decision-making. This made them excellent at logistics, organization, and long-term planning. But it made them terrible at the kind of fluid, aggressive combat that humanity had perfected over countless wars. The Velthic could fight, but they fought by overwhelming their enemies with numbers and technology, not through tactical brilliance or individual courage. Humans, Hyunwoo realized with growing amazement, were the opposite. Earth was what xenobiologists classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile that survival required constant adaptation and aggression. Humanity had evolved as persistence hunters, creatures that chased prey to exhaustion over days or weeks. They had survived ice ages, predators, diseases, and each other. Their brains rewarded risk-taking, problem-solving, and aggression. What the Velthic saw as insanity was simply human nature. Hyunwoo sent his findings to Admiral Borum with a simple conclusion. The Velthic could be beaten. Their superior technology could be overcome by superior tactics. Their larger numbers could be countered by humanity's willingness to take risks they would never consider. The key was to fight in ways that exploited their biological limitations. To be unpredictable, aggressive, and absolutely relentless. Borum read the report and smiled coldly. She already had a battle plan. Now she had the confidence that it might actually work. The Earth fleet, consisting of 200 vessels of various sizes and capabilities, moved out to meet the Velthic armada near Jupiter. On paper, it was suicide. 300 advanced warships against 200 primitive human craft. But Borum had not risen to her position by fighting fair. The battle began with the Velthic, advancing in their standard formation, expecting to simply overwhelm the human fleet with superior firepower. Instead, they encountered tactics they had never seen before. Human pilots flew their ships like extensions of their own bodies, weaving through enemy fire with maneuvers that should have been impossible. They used debris fields as cover, Jupiter's massive gravity well as a slingshot, and even their own damaged vessels as improvised weapons. Captain Subin led a fighter wing in an attack pattern based on ancient Earth aerial combat. Her squadron came out of Jupiter's upper atmosphere at speeds that made the Velthic sensors struggle to track them. They targeted the enemy flagship's point defense systems with coordinated strikes, overwhelming the automated defenses with sheer aggression and unpredictability. Sebin's fighter was hit 3 times, her ship trailing atmosphere and losing power. Any rational being would have retreated. Instead, she accelerated toward the flagship. Aiming for the reactor signature her sensors had identified, the Velthic crew saw her coming and tried desperately to destroy the incoming fighter. Their weapons tracked and fired, but Subin was already adjusting her approach, using every trick she had learned in a lifetime of flying. When her engines finally failed, she was less than a kilometer from the flagship. She used the last of her maneuvering thrusters to adjust course and rammed her crippled fighter directly into the enemy ship's main reactor. The explosion tore the flagship apart and damaged a dozen surrounding vessels. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Human crews fought with creativity and desperation that the Velthic could not match. When their weapons failed, they rammed. When their ships were crippled, they self-destructed in the midst of enemy formations. When capture seemed inevitable, they fought hand-to-hand in the corridors of their own vessels, making every boarding action a bloodbath. The humans were not just fighting. They were fighting like they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Fleet Commander Vorith watched his perfect formation fall apart into chaos. His ships were being destroyed by vessels that should not even be able to hurt them. His soldiers were being slaughtered by creatures that refused to follow any logical pattern of behavior. When a human boarding team somehow breached his command ship and started fighting their way toward the bridge, Vorath made the only decision his biology would allow. He ordered a retreat. The Velthic fleet fled, leaving behind the wreckage of over 100 ships and thousands of dead. The human fleet, reduced to barely 100 operational vessels, did not pursue. They could not. Many ships were barely holding together, kept functional only by the desperate ingenuity of their crews. Admiral Borum surveyed the battlefield and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had won. Against all odds and logic, humanity had defeated a superior force. But Borum knew this was only the beginning. The Velthic were just one species out of 847 in the Galactic Assembly. When news of this defeat reached the Assembly, they would respond with overwhelming force. Humanity had won a battle, but the war was just starting. She gave orders to begin salvage operations, to study every piece of Velthic technology they could recover, and to prepare for what was coming. On the Assembly Council headquarters, thousands of light years away, the news of the Velthic defeat was received with shock and disbelief. No newly discovered species had ever inflicted such losses on a punitive fleet. Most council members dismissed it as a fluke or exaggeration. Ambassador Giwan had never been particularly religious. But standing before the Galactic Assembly Council, felt like facing divine judgment. The council chamber was enormous, a space large enough to hold representatives from 847 different species. Thousands of eyes in hundreds of different forms watched her from the tiered seating that rose in a circle around the central platform where she stood alone. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of civilizations that had existed for millennia before humanity even learned to make fire. She had been granted this audience through channels that were deliberately insulting. Earth was not recognized as a legitimate government, so Ji-Wan was not technically an ambassador. She was classified as a petitioner, someone asking for the mercy of the council. The assembly expected her to beg, to apologize for humanity's resistance, to plead for terms that might spare her species from total annihilation. Guan had other plans. She activated the holographic projector she had been permitted to bring and began to speak. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly without fear. She thanked the council for their time and explained that she came with a message from the people of Earth. Humanity did not want war. They had only defended themselves when attacked. She presented humanity's terms: withdraw all hostile forces, recognize Earth as an independent, sovereign world, and negotiate a partnership based on mutual respect and equality. The council chamber filled with sounds that the translation devices struggled to interpret. Laughter, perhaps, or expressions of incredulity. High Chancellor Morthen, a being that looked like a collection of floating crystals held together by some invisible force, spoke in a voice that resonated through the chamber. The Chancellor explained, with tones of exaggerated patience, that the Assembly did not negotiate with species in violation of galactic law. Humanity's defiance had earned them punishment, not partnership. Gi-Wan smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. She expanded the holographic display, and suddenly the chamber was filled with images from Earth's history. Wars fought with stone weapons, battles involving millions of soldiers, cities burned to ash, nuclear explosions that turned day into night, 10,000 years of almost continuous warfare, displayed in brutal detail for species that had not fought a truly desperate war in millennia. She spoke about persistence hunting, explaining how humans once tracked prey for days across hostile terrain, never stopping, never giving up, until their target collapsed from exhaustion. She showed them footage of human soldiers in various historical conflicts, fighting in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands, adapting to every environment and every challenge. She displayed human weapons, from sharpened sticks to intercontinental ballistic missiles, demonstrating a species that turned violence into a science. Then, Ji-Wan delivered her real message. She explained that humanity had studied the Galactic Assembly extensively since first contact. They knew about the Assembly's structure, its reliance on overwhelming force rather than tactical innovation, its biological limitations. The Velthic defeat was not luck. It was inevitable. Because humanity was not like other species the Assembly had encountered. Humans were apex predators from a death world, a species that survived by being the most dangerous thing in any environment they entered. Ji-Wan's final words echoed through the silent chamber. Congratulations. You just declared war on the deadliest species alive. The hologram showed one last image. A human child's drawing of Earth surrounded by stars, with the simple caption, "We will not kneel." High Chancellor Morthen's response was cold fury. The council voted unanimously to dispatch the combined fleet immediately. 2,000 ships would reduce Earth to radioactive dust and serve as a warning to any other species that dared defy Assembly authority. Gi-Wan was escorted from the chamber and placed on a transport back to Earth. As she left, she noticed something interesting. Several representatives from various species were quietly leaving the chamber, speaking urgently into communication devices. Her message had been heard, and not everyone in the Assembly was convinced that attacking humanity was wise. On Earth, General Taejun prepared for the coming storm. Every military installation on the planet and throughout the solar system went to full alert. Hidden weapons platforms, constructed in secret over the past months, came online. Asteroid mining operations were hastily converted into mass drivers, capable of accelerating chunks of rock to devastating speeds. Every dock was working around the clock to repair damaged ships and construct new ones. But Taiyun's most important work was not military hardware. He was coordinating with civilian leaders to prepare the entire human population for total war. History had shown that the species that survived were the ones that could mobilize every resource and every person toward a common goal. Earth's 12 billion people were now a civilization with a single purpose: survival. The assembly fleet arrived 3 months later, and the solar system became a battlefield unlike anything in galactic history. The aliens had expected to find a defeated, demoralized population ready to surrender. Instead, they encountered a coordinated defense that turned every planet, moon, and asteroid into a weapons platform. Human ships, now equipped with reverse-engineered alien technology and devastating kinetic weapons, struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before the enemy could respond. The humans fought dirty. They used tactics the assembly considered dishonorable or illegal. They hacked enemy communications, spreading false orders and psychological warfare messages. They deployed mines that looked like debris. They pretended to retreat, then ambushed pursuers. They targeted supply ships and support vessels. Understanding that even the most powerful warship was useless without fuel and ammunition, Engineer Yunho led a team that successfully infiltrated the assembly's communication network using a combination of captured technology and human ingenuity. They flooded enemy channels with recordings of human battle cries, images of grinning soldiers in the midst of combat, and carefully edited footage of humanity's most brutal historical battles. The effect on the assembly forces was devastating. Species that had never faced an enemy that enjoyed combat found themselves psychologically unprepared for an opponent that seemed to thrive on violence. The combined fleet began to fracture. Different species had different tolerances for casualties, different protocols for retreat, different biological responses to prolonged stress. The humans exploited every division, every hesitation, every moment of coordination failure. When Velthic ships tried to maintain formation, human fighters targeted them specifically, making them pay for their previous attack on Mars. When other species tried to withdraw, the humans let them go, focusing their fury on those who continued the fight. Captain Murray commanded a destroyer that had been salvaged and rebuilt 3 times during the conflict. Her ship was a patchwork of human and alien technology. Held together by the skill of her engineering crew and the determination of her fighters, when a group of enemy vessels tried to break through to Earth's orbital defenses, Ray's ship intercepted them with a maneuver that defied physics and common sense. She used Earth's magnetic field to slingshot around the planet at speeds that should have torn her vessel apart, emerging behind the enemy formation and crippling their flagship before they realized what had happened. Throughout the solar system, similar heroics played out. Specialist Kyung led a team that infiltrated an assembly supply depot on one of Jupiter's moons, sabotaging enough equipment to cripple an entire battle group. Dr. Soyan, working from a research station on Earth, developed countermeasures to assembly weapons systems by studying their underlying principles and finding exploits that the aliens had never considered. Every human, whether in combat or support roles, contributed to a war effort that seemed impossible but refused to die. 3 weeks into the battle, the combined assembly fleet withdrew. They had lost over 60% of their vessels and achieved nothing except confirming that humanity was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The retreat was chaotic, with different species leaving at different times, their formation completely broken. High Chancellor Morthen sent a message to the Assembly Council, requesting immediate reinforcement and recommending a full-scale mobilization of all assembly military resources. But something had changed in the galaxy. The Battle of Seoul, as it came to be known, had been broadcast across assembly space through both official channels and the human hacking efforts. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds watched as a newly discovered species fought the combined might of the assembly to a standstill. Some were horrified. Many were inspired. Several species quietly contacted Earth, expressing admiration for humanity's courage in questioning whether the assembly's treatment of new species was truly just. 17 species formally withdrew from the military coalition against Earth, the Velthic Combine, having suffered the most severe losses in both battles, announced they would no longer participate in offensive operations against humanity. Their public statement was diplomatic, but the message was clear. They had learned their lesson. Other species followed, some citing casualties, others claiming resource shortages, still others simply refusing to explain their decisions. Lieutenant Nari had not slept in 3 days, but her eyes were bright with the kind of manic energy that came from a breakthrough that would change everything. She stood in the converted warehouse that served as Earth's central research facility, surrounded by the wreckage of captured assembly ships and the prototypes that her team had built from studying them. In her hands was a datapad containing equations and designs that represented humanity's best hope for survival, the faster-than-light drive. Every species in the assembly used some variation of the same basic technology, a method of folding space that allowed ships to travel between star systems in days rather than centuries. Humanity had been decades away from developing such technology on their own. Now, through a combination of captured hardware and desperate ingenuity, Nari's team had not only reverse-engineered the assembly drives, but improved upon them. The human version was faster, more efficient, and most importantly, could be manufactured using Earth's existing industrial base. Nari uploaded her designs to the military network and watched as the implications spread through Earth's command structure. Humanity no longer had to wait for the enemy to come to them. They could take the war to the assembly's territory. Admiral Borum saw the potential immediately. For 6 months, humanity had been fighting defensively, protecting their solar system against overwhelming odds. It was a strategy born of necessity, but it had a fatal flaw. Earth was fighting the entire galactic assembly on resources from a single star system. The assembly could afford to lose ships and soldiers because they had hundreds of worlds to draw upon. Humanity could not afford a war of attrition, no matter how bravely they fought. But if humans could strike at assembly territory, everything changed. Suddenly, the assembly would have to defend hundreds of systems instead of attacking one. Supply lines would become vulnerable. The member species would have to worry about defending their own worlds. Borum called together her senior commanders and laid out a new strategy. They would not wait for the Grand Armada. They would strike first, forcing the assembly to fight on multiple fronts. The first human offensive launched with 30 ships, all equipped with the new FTL drives and loaded with enough weapons to fight their way through enemy space. Their target was an assembly supply depot in a system 12 light-years from Earth, a massive station that supported military operations across an entire sector. The attack was swift and brutal, catching the defenders completely unprepared for the arrival of human warships so deep in assembly territory. The depot was destroyed in less than 3 hours. The human ships used tactics that the assembly had never encountered, hitting from multiple vectors, using hit-and-run attacks, and exploiting every weakness in the station's defenses. When assembly reinforcements arrived, the human fleet was already gone. Jumping to their next target before the enemy could respond, over the following weeks, similar attacks hit military installations, supply convoys, and communications relays across a dozen systems. The assembly had never faced asymmetric warfare on an interstellar scale. Their military doctrine was built around massive fleets engaging in direct combat. The idea of small, fast-moving forces striking at vulnerable targets and disappearing before help could arrive was foreign to their experience. Human crews, drawing on thousands of years of guerrilla warfare tactics, turned the vastness of space into their greatest weapon. They could attack anywhere, at any time, and the assembly had no way to predict where they would strike next. Specialist Kyung led what Earth Command called Black Operations, missions, so dangerous that volunteers were told up front they probably would not survive. His team of 12 infiltrated an assembly fortress world, a heavily defended planet that served as a regional military headquarters. For 2 months, they operated behind enemy lines, sabotaging equipment, stealing intelligence, and spreading chaos throughout the military base. The assembly garrison knew humans were somewhere on their world, but they could not find them. Kung's team used techniques refined over centuries of spycraft and special operations. They hid in plain sight, moved through maintenance tunnels, and exploited the assembly's reliance on automated systems. By the time the garrison finally cornered them in an abandoned warehouse district, Kung's team had already transmitted complete schematics of assembly military installations to Earth Command, along with detailed information about security protocols, defensive weaknesses, and supply routes. The final stand lasted 6 hours. 12 humans against 500 assembly soldiers, fighting in the ruins of industrial buildings with weapons they had improvised or stolen. When it ended, Kyung and his entire team were dead, but they had killed over 100 enemy soldiers and destroyed enough equipment to cripple the garrison's operations for months. More importantly, the intelligence they provided allowed Earth to plan attacks that crippled assembly logistics across an entire region. The psychological impact of these operations was as important as the military damage. Assembly species began to fear humanity in a way they had never feared any enemy before. Humans could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and seemed to care nothing for their own survival if it meant completing their mission. Rumors spread through assembly space about human soldiers who continued fighting even when mortally wounded, about ships that rammed enemy vessels when their weapons failed, about tactics so aggressive they bordered on suicidal. Back on Earth, Engineer Yunho worked on a different kind of weapon. He had been studying the Assembly's artificial intelligence systems and discovered something fascinating. Assembly AI was incredibly advanced in many ways, far beyond anything humanity had developed. But it had a critical weakness. The AI was programmed by species that thought in fundamentally different ways than humans. Species that avoided risk and preferred predictable, logical solutions. Yunho created what he called a logic bomb, a computer virus specifically designed to exploit the assembly AI's inability to comprehend sacrificial tactics. When deployed, the virus would present the AI with scenarios based on human military history. Last stands where soldiers fought to the death to buy time for others. Kamikaze attacks that traded one life for many. Tactical retreats that sacrificed ground to preserve forces. The assembly AI, unable to process the logic behind such decisions, would lock up trying to calculate optimal responses. The virus was deployed during a major engagement in the outer systems. An assembly battle group, arriving to reinforce a station under human attack, suddenly found their fire control systems failing, their navigation computers providing contradictory information, and their automated defensive grid shutting down. The human attack force, smaller and less powerful on paper, tore through the confused enemy formation with ease. After that battle, Earth's Cyber Warfare Division became as feared as their combat pilots. Dr. Hyunwoo continued his work studying captured assembly soldiers and technology. His latest discovery was both promising and concerning. He had found a way to modify human ships to emit a specific combination of electromagnetic frequencies that triggered fear responses in certain assembly species. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but it made those species significantly less effective in combat, causing biological stress reactions that impaired decision-making and coordination. The moral implications troubled Hinwoo. Was using an enemy's biology against them ethical? But then he remembered Sergeant Dae-yoon and the 50 Marines who died on Mars. Remembered the Assembly's casual offer to enslave 100 million humans. Remembered that humanity was fighting for its very survival. This was not a time for philosophical debates about fair fighting. This was a war of extinction. Humanity would use every advantage they could find, as human forces continued their offensive operations. The Grand Armada finally assembled and began its approach to Earth. 6,000 ships, representing the largest military force the Assembly had ever gathered. High Chancellor Morthen commanded from a battleship that was itself larger than most human space stations. The Chancellor was confident that this time, with such overwhelming force, humanity would finally be crushed. But Morthen did not know that Earth had been preparing for this moment for 6 months. The solar system had been transformed into the most heavily fortified location in known space. Every asteroid large enough to hold equipment had been turned into a weapons platform. The space between planets was seeded with mines and automated defense drones. Earth itself was surrounded by orbital defense stations that could lay down enough firepower to destroy fleets. More importantly, humanity had learned from every previous engagement. They had studied how the assembly fought, identified patterns in their tactics, and developed specific countermeasures for every threat. Admiral Borum had a battle plan that incorporated every lesson learned, every advantage gained, every desperate innovation that necessity had created. The Grand Armada was coming to finish the war. Borum intended to give them a battle they would never forget. Commander Jinho, promoted to overall strategic command, reviewed the positions of every human asset in the solar system. He had started this war standing in an orbital station, facing an alien ambassador who offered slavery as if it were a gift. The Battle of Seoul began, not with a massive assault, but with a choice. High Chancellor Morthon broadcast a message to Earth, offering one final chance for surrender. The terms had not changed from the first contact. Submit to Assembly authority. Provide resources and labor. Accept your place in the Galactic Order. The only difference was that now, Morthon assured them, the punishment for their resistance would be measured. If humanity surrendered immediately, Earth would be occupied but not destroyed. If they continued to fight, the planet would be reduced to lifeless rock. Commander Ginho's response was broadcast. It's not just to the Chancellor, but across all frequencies, ensuring that every ship in the Grand Armada would hear it. He thanked Morthon for the offer and politely declined. Earth had already given its answer on Mars in the battles around Jupiter, in the raids across assembly space. Humanity would not surrender, would not submit, would not kneel. If the assembly wanted Earth, they would have to take it from the cold, dead hands of every human who called it home. The Chancellor gave the order to attack. 6,000 ships began their advance into the solar system, moving in the same massive formations that had intimidated hundreds of species over thousands of years. It was meant to be overwhelming, unstoppable, the inexorable advance of galactic civilization against primitive resistance. Instead, it became a nightmare that High Chancellor Morthon would remember for the rest of a very short life. The humans had turned the entire solar system into a weapon. As the Grand Armada advanced past Neptune's orbit, they encountered the first layer of defense. Thousands of asteroids that had been hollowed out and filled with explosives, positioned throughout the outer system and covered with sensor-absorbing materials that made them look like ordinary space debris. When the Armada passed through what should have been empty space, those asteroids detonated in a carefully coordinated sequence, creating a wave of high-velocity shrapnel that tore through shields, designed to stop energy weapons. The Armada lost 200 ships in the first 10 minutes, and they had not even seen an enemy vessel yet. The survivors pushed forward, now aware that humans had weaponized the environment itself. They approached Jupiter with increased caution, scanning for threats. That caution saved some ships, but not enough. The gas giant's massive gravity well had been turned into a slingshot for kinetic missiles. Chunks of metal and ice accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. When they struck, they hit with the force of nuclear weapons. Admiral Borum watched from her command ship, positioned deep within Jupiter's atmosphere, where enemy sensors could barely detect her. She had spent 6 months studying assembly tactics, and she had noticed something important. They fought like they were playing a strategy game, moving formations in predictable patterns, relying on numerical superiority and firepower. They did not improvise well. They did not adapt quickly. And they absolutely did not expect their enemies to use the battlefield itself as a weapon. The human fleet emerged from hiding positions throughout the solar system, hitting the Armada from unexpected angles. Captain Myray led a squadron that attacked from behind Saturn's rings. Using the ice and rock as both cover and additional ammunition, her ships were equipped with mass drivers that could accelerate ring material to devastating velocities, turning Saturn's natural beauty into a shotgun blast that shredded enemy formations. Sergeant Daeun had been posthumously promoted to commander, and his name had become a rallying cry for human Marines throughout the system. The boarding tactics he had pioneered on Mars were now standard procedure, refined and improved through months of bitter experience. When human ships closed with enemy vessels, Marines would breach the hulls and fight through corridors with a ferocity that assembly soldiers could not match. The Velthic, remembering Mars, would often abandon ship rather than face human boarders. General Taejun coordinated the defense from Earth's surface, directing both orbital platforms and ground-based weapons. When parts of the Armada tried to bypass the fighting and strike directly at Earth, they encountered defensive fire so intense it looked like a wall of light. Every major city on the planet had been fortified, every citizen trained in basic defense procedures. If any enemy managed to land, they would face 12 billion humans who had no intention of going quietly. The battle raged for 3 days. The Grand Armada, designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers, found itself unable to coordinate effectively as human attacks disrupted communications and sowed chaos through their formations. Different species within the Armada had different combat doctrines, different tolerances for casualties, different protocols for dealing with unexpected situations. The humans exploited every division, every moment of hesitation, every failure of coordination. Dr. Hyenwoo's fear frequency weapons proved devastatingly effective against several assembly species. Ships equipped with the modified emitters would approach enemy formations and trigger biological panic responses that caused entire squadrons to break formation and retreat. It was not technically killing them, but it removed them from the battle just as effectively. Some assembly commanders protested that this violated the rules of warfare. Apparently unaware of the irony of complaining about unfair tactics while trying to commit genocide, engineer. Yunho's logic bombs continued to plague assembly computer systems. The virus had evolved and spread, jumping from ship to ship through normal communication channels. Assembly crews found their systems behaving erratically at critical moments, providing false information or simply refusing commands that the AI deemed illogically dangerous. Some ships became so unreliable that their crews abandoned them, adding to the growing sense of chaos and defeat spreading through the Armada. On the third day of battle, with the Grand Armada reduced to fewer than 3,000 functional vessels, High Chancellor Morthen made a decision that defied every instinct the Chancellor possessed. Rather than retreat, rather than preserve what remained of the Armada, Morthen ordered a final push directly at Earth. If the Assembly could not conquer humanity, they would at least ensure that humanity died with them. It was, in its own way, the most human decision the Chancellor had ever made. Commander. Ginho saw the enemy's last desperate push and understood what it meant. This was no longer about conquest or punishment. This was about mutual destruction, a final act of spite from a dying force. He gave orders that he knew would be controversial, orders that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. The human fleet was to allow enemy ships to approach Earth, drawing them deeper into the system's defensive networks. It was a risk, but Jinho believed that the closer the enemy came, the more devastating humanity's defenses would prove. High Chancellor Morthen's flagship led the final assault. Heading directly for Earth at maximum speed, the human defenses took a terrible toll, destroying ship after ship, but some vessels broke through. The Chancellor's own battleship, damaged but still functional, entered Earth's orbit with perhaps 200 other survivors. It should have been a moment of triumph, the beginning of planetary bombardment that would end the war. Instead, it became a trap. The surviving assembly ships found themselves surrounded by Earth's orbital defense stations, by human vessels that had followed them in, and by weapons platforms that had been hidden on the moon and nearby asteroids. Captain Murray, her ship barely holding together but still fighting, led the final assault on the enemy flagship. Her weapons were mostly gone, her shields failed, her crew reduced to a fraction of their original numbers. But she still had engines, and she still had determination. As Moray's ship accelerated toward the flagship, she thought about Sergeant Daeyoon ramming his fighter into an enemy ship, about Captain Subin doing the same months later, about every human who had given everything to protect their home. She armed the ship's self-destruct sequence and set a collision course. The assembly crew tried desperately to destroy her ship, but human engineering had learned from 6 months of constant warfare. The vessel held together just long enough. The explosion destroyed the flagship and damaged a dozen nearby vessels. High Chancellor Morthen died without understanding how things had gone so wrong, how a species the Assembly had dismissed as primitive had brought the greatest military force in galactic history to complete defeat. The remaining assembly ships, their command structure shattered and their will broken, stopped fighting. Some tried to flee. Others simply shut down their weapons and waited for whatever would come next. But what came next surprised everyone. Commander Ginho gave an order that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. Let them go. The human forces ceased fire, allowing the surviving enemy ships to retreat. Some of his commanders protested, arguing that they should destroy every last vessel to ensure the assembly could never threaten Earth again. Ginho refused. Humanity had proven they could win, proven they were strong enough to stand against the entire galaxy. Now it was time to prove they were wise enough to build peace. Admiral Borum broadcast a message across all channels. It's transmitted from every human ship and every captured assembly communication relay. The message was simple and profound. Humanity had never wanted this war.